So we're going to go ahead and get rolling. This is our conclusion to the Problem of Evil series. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the Problem of Evil as we've interacted with it. How as Christians how can a good God exist while also saying that good, all these things that evil and suffering exist, right? So we interacted with that at first. We first talked about the poor arguments that Christians make, right? Like the things like, God has a plan for you, or just like, oh, well, I'm praying for you, or, the Lord gives and takes away, and we just use these Christian cliches that aren't helpful. Then what we did is we said, well, first off, we got to come up with some decent defenses, right? So we discussed different theodicies. And of course, our theodicy is God's justice, is how we describe it, like how we can justify these things. So we had, remember, heaven theodicy, free will theodicy. We had the soul-building theodicy. Then we had the Reformed theodicy. You might remember we did not like the Reformed theodicy, or at least I didn't. But then after that, we decided, all right, now that we have our theodicies, we understand what how we can respond to these problems. We looked at the logical argument from evil, which states that if evil and suffering exists, God cannot exist. It's a very strong statement, but we showed how logically speaking it does not hold up. Then, of course, the week after, we did the evidential argument, which is, well, due to the amount of suffering in the world, it's more likely that God does not exist, which is a lot weaker of a claim, but it's also, in a sense, stronger and more convincing, right? So then we interacted with that. And then we talked last time about the problem of hell, right? And that was because there's two things that oftentimes come up when you're discussing with atheists. They'll talk about hell, how could God exist and hell exist. So then we talked about the three major views of hell, right? And then now this week I am going to go over the problem of the Old Testament, or also just the atrocities of the Old Testament. This is going to be an overview, not a series. And not hindsight being 2020 and all, I know when I said, hey guys, vote for what subjects you want next, the nature of man or the doctrine of man won out a lot, by the way. I was kind of surprised, but I'm okay with that because I have a lot of material on that already. Saves me from having to make a lot more lesson plans. But the other thing we can do is we can eventually go into a deeper dive of the law of the Old Testament, if you guys would like ever to do that. Bit dry, but important. So, all right, with that being said, we're going to ask the question today on the atrocities of, no, actually, when I say the atrocities of the Old Testament, how many of you guys know what I'm talking about? Really? Okay, Brandon. Right. What are some of the things that come to mind? Just spitfire them. What are some things that come to mind?
Is it like to kill every man, woman, and child?
Killing every man, woman, and child, like in Jericho, right?
Yeah.
All right. What are other ones?
Pillar of salt.
Which one?
Pillar of salt.
Pillar of salt. Pillar of salt. Yeah, with looking back, Lot's wife turned into a pillar of salt. What are other ones? Just want to make sure we kind of got our brains in the right place on what we're going to have to talk about. I'm thinking of a very big one that kind of covers a lot of stuff. The flood, right? The flood, that's a big one. And then
Covers a lot of stuff.
that does cover a lot of stuff. So, needless to say, if Christians are going to say that we serve the one perfectly good, holy being, we have to talk about some of that stuff, right? Because then people are like, okay, but that seems harsh, right? So we should talk about that. And now I'm not going to be able to completely talk about everything, right? This is not an Old Testament survey class, all right? This is a quick class to give you an overview of some of these things and how we respond to them. And then at another time, we can go into a deeper dive. So the question is God a cosmic bully? This is oftentimes what people say. So many people find the biblical narrative of the Old Testament to be incoherent with God, the God of the New Testament. Have you guys ever heard that? Like people go, well, the Old Testament is the God of the law, and the New Testament is the God of mercy. Or even Christians will go, well, that was the time of law and justice, and this is the time of grace. Problem is,
He was merciful in the Old Testament.
what?
He was merciful in the Old Testament too.
Exactly, but yeah, exactly. It creates an incoherency within God, right? So what ends up happening is that we go, well, God was gracious here, merciful here, but not during this time, and it creates incoherency if we try to create too much of a divide. And I know this is, since we're a dispensational church, that is a tendency amongst very strong dispensationalists to try to do that. Now I don't think that's something we do here, and I'm thankful for that. But I have seen that that is a weakness in the dispensational circles. We talk about the weaknesses in the Reformed circles. Well, the least we can do is do some friendly fire once in a while, right? So be careful not to fall into that. So many people find that it's incoherent. So basically, here's the thought. If you want the best theology, you will get it in the life of Jesus. That's what people will say. If you want the best theology, you'll get in the life of Jesus, which is true. But in the New Testament, we have a God who seems to be willing to die for mankind, but we hear that in the Old Testament, God seems angry and desires blood. So skeptics will say that according to the Bible, your God is just an angry, maniacal, and he's bloodthirsty. That's what they will say. Now, how many guys know who a famous atheist known as Richard Dawkins is? Okay. Richard Dawkins said this. Christians believe their God is all good and all loving. Atheists counter that according to Christians' own Bible. God is instead the most unpleasant character in all fiction, jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniac, sodomachist. Wow.
I was going to say, how are you going to get through those big words?
Sadomasochist, thank you. I was trying to get through it. And I was like, well, I screwed that one up. Sadomasochist, capriciously malevolent bully.
Everything he just said was a lie.
So, you read that, and that is some very strong...
Sorry, didn't mean to steal your place.
Strong statement, strong opinion. This guy, needless to say, does not like the God of the Bible.
What's filicidal?
Filicidal. That's actually a great question. Filicidal. I can Google it if you'd like. I want to. What in the world?
Killing one's own sons and daughters.
That makes sense. All right. Thank you. All right. So, needless to say, not awesome. So, however, responding to this particular quote, but something, so we're not going to respond to this particular quote, I should say, but something to balance out this blasphemous drivel that we just heard. Another atheist named Michael Rue says, Dawkins' arguments are so bad that I'm embarrassed to call myself an atheist. So, there's that.
Arguing among themselves?
Oh yeah, they do. Just like Christian philosophers, we argue among ourselves. It's a good time in that world. But here's the thing. Obviously, now, to go back to that slide real fast. For example, one of the things he says that he's jealous and he's proud of it. Problem is, we're looking at it like he is clearly not trying to even look at us properly. When we say God is a jealous God, we're not saying that he's like us, where I see that you're driving a BMW and I'm jealous you have that, or I'm jealous that you have more money than me. That's not the type of jealousy.
Jealous of idols,
right.
wishing to worship somebody else.
Right, of
And
faithfulness.
That's true.
Right.
He is.
Right. Well, and that's the idea that not all jealousy is bad, right? Because if I'm married, and if my wife went to cheat on me, I would be rightfully within my rights to be jealous, right? Not that you ever would. You're a wonderful woman. What is it, wait?
Dawkins has no concept of holiness.
Right.
He has no concept of holy, which means separate. It's a whole. God lives in a whole separate, different domain.
Right. So because he rejects what we would say is holiness, it brings him to a bad philosophical conclusion, right? So there's a book that has become pretty popular in the Christian world. I have a copy. I definitely recommend you to read it. It's called "Is God a Moral Monster?" by Dr. Paul Copan. I actually had the privilege of interviewing him about 2 years ago, and he just released another book called "Is God a Vindictive Bully?" And in both of them, he goes through the Old Testament, he looks at the archaeology, he looks at the culture, and he interacts with that, and he kind of shows where the errors are being made when people are looking at the texts. Does that make sense? So, Ben.
So it's a Christian perspective.
Yes.
Answering those questions.
Absolutely. Now, there's a tendency, in, say, like Lifeway Christian bookstores, or, Baker bookstore, evangelical Christianity, to downplay kind of the strictness of God a little bit, right? Because we hear it all the time. Even today's message, we hear a lot of an emphasis of grace, 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 which is good. That's true. God is gracious. But also, God is righteous. He is holy. He is direct. He is strict. And he reserves the right to bring judgment. That's his job. He's God.
You've shown us several times where cursing you for generation to generation doesn't really mean that. But at the same time, just me and my Bible reading efforts, God was pretty rough in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and that's what we're gonna. And that's also part of it is because so the Mosaic Law, for example, that is a text that is thousands of years old in an ancient Near Eastern setting with a totally different culture and different way they write laws. We read the Bible oftentimes as Westerners, as 21st century Westerners, and then we look at it and go, "This is horrible. That they said this." But we miss the kind of how the law was applied because we're so far removed from the culture. So there's a lot of things like that where God was rough in the Old Testament, but there's also a lot of rough things that were around the Old Testament. And we'll talk about that because one of the biggest problems that people do is they read the Bible through a 21st century post-Geneva Convention mindset, right? We don't even use flamethrowers now, no chemical warfare. This is that's not the world that this Bible was written in. It's a totally different world. So before you judge any of those ancient texts, and I'm not even talking about the Bible, but the Hammurabi laws and all of them, you have to remember the world that they're living in is far more savage than ours. So, Paul, you look like you're going to say something.
I was going to say too, like when you look at those laws, there's a difference between like we just think of like laws as laws, but there's moral laws, there's ceremonial laws.
Mm-hmm.
Laws that apply to a different context than we just think of, well, it's law.
Right. No, it's absolutely true. It's absolutely true because that's why to this day Jews don't make sacrifices because sacrifices were done in the temple. Well, it's not a temple anymore, right? And they're not even on the Temple Mount. So therefore, the ritual laws aren't being fulfilled because they're unable to. So that's some of the things to consider there. But now, here's the thing about the Mosaic Law. Let's talk about this. So it is often viewed as barbaric by today's standards. However, most of it is actually misunderstood, and that's one of the biggest problems when we read the Old Testament, is that we misunderstand it. The world was far more, as I mentioned, barbaric in the Old Testament, and Israel actually offered rights and goodness rather than a lot of the things that the surrounding nations did. So a lot of people don't know that Israel, a lot of people wanted to be among Israel because women had rights. They were more than just childbearers. Your slaves had rights, and we'll talk about slavery here in a minute, how that worked in the Old Testament. Many Christians teach that God meets people where they are at and draws them toward his most perfect ways, and we call this progressive revelation. And that's not an entirely insane view. The problem is with using progressive revelation to get out of the question. I hear Christians do this all the time. Well, God told Moses X, Y, Z, and we go, well, we're not under the law anymore. Do you think that answered their question? No. You gave them like a theological dismission as opposed to actually being like, well, how about we talk about that issue? Because if it's the same God, it's the same God. It doesn't matter whether or not you're under the law. Why would God create that law in the first place is their concern, right? So that's something we got to be looking into. Many Christians teach that God meets people where they are. So yes, progressive revelation, you can mention that, but that's not something where you probably should go if someone's asking these things. So however, I do still think it does not deal, again, with the passages themselves. And remember, this can create moral confusion if we're not addressing their concern. Rather, let's take a closer look at some of these passages within their Judaic, ancient Near Eastern context and have a better understanding as to why. And the reason why I want to emphasize Judaic, ancient Near Eastern context is because Israel was different than Samaria. Israel was different than Assyria and the Canaanites and the Amalekites. They're different than all of them. So if we just go, well, ancient Near Eastern culture, there's some overlap between the cultures, but they are all different as well. Does that make sense? It's like trying to lump all of Ireland and Scotland together and just say that they're all the same culture. Well, not really. There's overlap, but they're different, right? As much as I give my friend Andrew a hard time for saying that they're all the same, they're not, right? So let's take a look at these responses. So here are some of the ways you can respond, or Christians have responded to the Mosaic Law and some of the barbarism that we would see in the Old Testament that people perceive as barbarism. So, moral improvement. So some people say, well, this is the moral improvement view, that God meets mankind where they are at and continually points them to moral betterment. Right? So, all right, ancient Near Eastern culture, super barbaric. So I'm going to give you a list of laws that points you to something better, and then over time, bring people to a better life and understanding. Then Jesus comes, he teaches even better stuff, and then, okay, now the Apostle Paul teaches, and boom, now we have a better understanding, but like kind of working with man. And you can kind of understand that, right? God meeting you where you're at, slowly leading you along to something of better understanding. I think some of us can actually say that that's happened in our own lives, where we had one understanding, and over time we grew and gained better understanding. So that's not a terrible response, okay? However, I don't think it always deals with it perfectly. So I believe there is some truth to this, right? After all, being surrounded by Canaanites, Amalekites, and other enemies would probably force your society to live a bit more harshly than not, right? So that doesn't mean that they were morally incorrect to do so, right? So in the Jewish context, for example, we read a lot about the death penalty, right? And they shall surely be put to death. They shall surely be put to death. We read that a lot. Well, one thing, in the Jewish context, the death penalty was viewed as a mercy. Because one, you're preventing the person from sinning against their soul and is against God even further. And you're also preventing sin from infecting your group, which is why it says, cast the evil person from among you, or cast the evil from among you. Now, some people go, that is really harsh. Let me explain this to you. If you were surrounded by the Assyrians, for example, the Assyrians, by historians, have been called the Nazis of the ancient world. Canaanites were known to burn their children alive in sacrifices to Moloch. Okay? These people, they don't even care about their own children enough to spare them, right? Now, you're surrounded by these types, and then you have somebody who's going morally corrupt among you, and you're already surrounded. You're a smaller nation, and you're surrounded by nothing but enemies. Well, guess what happens if you start infecting your own group with that? More people defect, you have moral collapse, and then you have what happened to Rome. Well, you can't afford for that to happen, hence why such extreme measures would be taken. Also, keep in mind that everyone, this starts stuff that that a lot of us miss when reading the Torah, okay, the Old Testament, or I should say the Law of Moses, when we're reading the Torah. Every Israelite had the choice whether to stay an Israelite. So in other words, if you stayed, you were like, I agree with these rules. And if you didn't, you were allowed to leave. They weren't going to kill you for leaving. You were allowed to. Like, you know what? This isn't for me. I'm out. Then, okay. It's amazing, though. I was just reading through Joshua, and people chose and wanted to make a covenant with Israel. And it's like, and they wanted to join them because people were like, yeah, whatever they're doing, they got something way better going on than what we got going on over here. For example, so there's a lot of things with that to consider, okay? But that's why they look as a mercy for their people, mercy for each other, things like that. Also, the death penalty was not something that was executed flippantly. A lot of people seem to think like, oh, adultery, boom, throw them outside, kill them with a stone, right? That's not the way the Torah operated. The Torah is what we call case law, which means if then this, then this. If then, okay? If this happens, this happens. The thing is, what we were missing as well is that in the case law, it's when it says the death penalty, it also can basically mean, and this is something that we miss as Westerners, because we read things literally, right? We're very literal. When it says death penalty, it basically, there's like an unspoken up to death penalty, not necessarily always death penalty. So in certain situations, a fine would be charged. But that's why there had to be an establishment of 2 to 3 witnesses. And then they had to go before the judges, what we would call something like the Sanhedrin, and they would hear the case, compare the facts, and then, this is actually the Sanhedrin's job. I don't know if you guys know this. Sanhedrin, their job was to actually try to disqualify the witnesses. So, all right, if there's a conflict in the story, you're disqualified. If you are somebody who, like, there's a conflict of interest, you're disqualified. And the reason why they did this was because they wanted to try to show mercy as God showed mercy. So they would hear the case, and they would try to find any way they could to get anyone out of that. And it's not because they were trying to find legal loopholes, but God specifically made this law and put these people together to make sure that these things didn't happen regularly. In fact, if you read the Mishnah, if a high priest had more than 2 people killed over the period of 6 to 7 years, he was considered bloodthirsty. Yeah. So when you think about it, and the more you read about it, the more you realize it's not as black and white as we make it out to be. And it actually drives me a little crazy, the fact that this isn't not as well known in the Christian world as it should be, which is why I've taken Judaic studies very seriously and more finding the Mishnah to be very helpful. But anyway, with that being said, let's talk about slaves. Now, how many of you guys have ever heard people bring up slaves in the Bible and say, how could God allow slaves? Okay. How many of
I
you
have that
guys...
question myself.
Go what?
I have that question myself.
Perfect. All right, no, that's great. Oh. Got to get caffeinated. All right, so here's the thing with the slaveries. Let me ask you. When I say slave, what do you think of? Property. Maybe you guys get flashbacks of something like the antebellum South, right? Mm-hmm. Right, yes, what people did to Africans and even like Irish people even. Unfortunately, Andrew, you are free. For those who do not know, Andrew's from Ireland, so I give him a hard time. So anyway, well, the slavery isn't the same. It's not the same, and actually, guys, it was a social benefit. Now, some of you, your head just went spinning. But again, we come at this from a 21st century post-Geneva Convention. You have your rights, the Constitution, blah, 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 right? They didn't. They didn't even have half the social system. Now, guess what? If you can't afford, let's say you live in poverty and you have children, what can you apply for? Food stamps, you can get in Section 8 housing possibly.
There's their welfare system.
Right. There's a whole welfare system, right?
Yeah, no, I mean the slavery was a welfare system.
Exactly.
That's what you did, you soldiers. And then, I'm going to get ahead of you a little bit, you could only keep them for so long if you were Jew and you had them go.
Right. So that's exactly it. You got right ahead of me. But that's exactly it. So let's say Dominic, I'm going to pick on you. Dominic, he's down on his luck. He can't keep a good job. He can't make any money. And back then, your property was as important as your money, right? Because you usually had the animals that helped with your trade, things like that. Well, let's say I had a lot of property. I had a lot of sheep. I had a lot of cattle. I had a lot of people working for me. Well, then Dominic's like, well, I need to survive. And he comes to me, he's like, I will sell myself as your servant. And my job then, if I accepted, was he lives in my house. I provide housing, food, everything for him. And then he works for me like an employee. And then what ends up happening is that I teach him over that course of 7 years how to do the job. And then after 7 years, that they were commanded to let them go, to free them. And that way, if he wanted to go build his own life, he was able to with all the skills that he just acquired. Also, at any time, I could release him from that debt. The other thing, yeah, Brandon.
Don't some translations change it to bond servant instead of slave?
Yep. Well, that's where like that. And then what would happen? Have you guys ever heard of that thing where they took the ear and punctured it? So what would happen also? Let's say I was a really great employer. He's like, I got a pretty good life here. I met a woman. I have kids, because he could actually get married and have kids. Like if I had there's a servant girl, and I'm like, well, you guys want to get married? You guys could do that. And then boom, now you have kids. And he could go, you know what? I have a pretty good life. Actually, I'd like to stay. He had every right to do that for the rest of his life if he wanted to. And then what would happen is that they would do the piercing the ear with like a nail, and then they have a hole in the ear, and it was called a bondservant. It would show that you belonged to that household. And it's so basically it was their welfare system. They didn't have a government that just handed things out. They had to come up with something amongst the society themselves. Well, what do you do when you're desert people in the middle of nowhere surrounded by enemies? Well, probably the only thing you can do if somebody has nothing is to take people in. And then, all right, you work for me. Because also, to the Jews and to Israel, if you did not work, you did not eat, essentially. So hey, I'll take care of you, but you have to work. But they also got the Sabbath. They still got to celebrate the holidays. There's even laws like if someone was a servant in another kingdom, I could treat them however I wanted, right? I could do horrible things to them. But in Israel, I would not be allowed to. In fact, there's this one where it's like let's say I have a really disobedient servant, and now people don't like the fact that you I hit him. Like I was able to beat him with a rod because let's say he, attacked my child or was very malicious in some sense. Well, if he died within a certain period of time, I would be charged for his death. However, if within a year later he died, I think it was over a year, then you would not be charged. Because then it was within a certain week. It was a week, and then apparently according to the mission, that could go up to a year, if memory serves. Now I'm not sure, but I'm now self-doubting. But there's like a period of time with that. So, and again, we look at it like, well, it's horrible. But remember, this is a different world. Okay, it's a totally different world. So some of these things we're looking at in the wrong light. And then the other thing that people will point out in Scripture is like, well, then it says about the same with like a rapist or blah 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 blah. So God's okay with rape. No, this is what we call fallacy. A lot of people will be like, this is in the Bible. Justify it. Well, just because it is in the Bible doesn't mean it ought to have happened, right? So just because it is in the law, like, for example, you hear this. If a young man lays with a young woman, well, is he saying that that's okay before they're married? No, it says if this happens, then he either marries her or he has to pay the bride price to the father to pay the dowry. So that's not saying that it ought to be. It's saying that if that does happen, though, here's how you execute that issue. Now, some people have a problem with that because they're like, well, it makes it out like you're just like trading women for money, right? Well, he sleeps with her, so he has to marry or pay the father. Do you guys understand how much a dowry costs a young man? It was a ton of money. And the reason why was because it was a gesture of the young man that I will take care of your daughter. You can trust me with her because guess what? Women, this is pre-feminism, okay? You were not strong, independent women back then. You were vulnerable, right? You were surrounded by hostile nations who would kidnap women, put them in sex slavery, and all sorts of stuff. So women had to be protected. So they were always under the authority of their father or their husband, always under some sort of protection. Because women actually in Israel were cherished. These are things that people don't talk to you about. Which is why a lot of those weird laws exist because, well, I'm not allowed to just take advantage of a young woman because virginity was highly favored. So, and I just took the right of the husband, of her future husband. So now you either become her husband or you pay the piper. Well, I don't have the money. Well, then you probably should have thought about that before you did the deed, right? And now suddenly there is a lot higher of a stake there. And then also the reason for that is so basically it was a system to make sure that young women aren't taken advantage of. Does that make sense? Which we could bring some of that back today. Some people are like, well, do you want to get your law from the law of Moses? I'm like, some of those things I have zero objections on with our society today. They can use a little bit more propriety. So anyway, so slavery, many people do not view slavery in the Torah at all. It was actually a system, as I said, of economic advancement. So that was what it was used for. Now granted, if someone was from a neighboring kingdom, if they were, instead of being killed, now let's say they were your enemies, right? These are people who burn children, remember, all that sort of thing. You took them in. Now at this point, that was a little bit hard. You could treat them, they had different rights than a Hebrew. So an Israelite, 7 years guaranteed, and there's a lot of rights that came with being a Hebrew. If you were from a foreign country, that there were looser laws there. But it's also because usually if you were spared in war, and after all the things that you had done, there could be rebellion amongst the people themselves after you showed them mercy. And again, barbaric world means that harsher responses are necessary sometimes. And all these, but even the foreign slaves and slaves is a very loose word for servant or bond servants of sorts, okay? So even then, they had rights. You couldn't just like outright abuse them and rape them, kill them, do whatever you want with them. They didn't become like your property in that sense. So people hear the word when they read that they will be your property. What was that?
They had to come to America for that?
Yeah, exactly. So, but people read that and they'll be your property. It's like property. People don't belong as property. I'm like, well, they didn't have like the word for employer back then. In fact, a lot of times you see the word servant continually, even in the New Testament, right? And their servant so-and-so. Well, it's a nice way of saying your employee. Now, it's not an exact one-to-one ratio, but it's a similar enough system where I think sometimes we're like, oh, okay, because I can't always afford all those things, but I can live in a very rich. That's why like it was a thing to be a Lord's servant was like you were high on that totem pole. Like who you're servant to who? Oh, dang, you're somebody. And it's like you're a slave or a servant, and we think of it as just like, oh, you're a little peon. But that's because we're Americans. We're all like freedom, individualism, let's go. That's not how their society worked. So again, when you're reading the Torah with a problem of evil in mind, you have to shift your perspective. I was told by an old friend of mine this week, actually. It was funny, in preparation for this, I listened to a whole atheist talk show talking about this from a guy who had a PhD in like ancient Assyria and Samaria, like ethics and stuff. And it was funny as I was listening, and he was like, but the Bible says this, and he's an atheist. And I'm like, wow, you really, like, you're a PhD in this field, and you don't even, apparently haven't read the Mishnah, you haven't read a lot of these things, which is fine because they're totally different types of things, but that's where confusion can take place. And I was like, well, if you read it from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, I was telling an old friend of mine I grew up with, who's probably an agnostic atheist now. And he's like, well, the problem is that you're saying that I have to read that with a certain set of lenses. And I was like, yes, you have to read everything with a certain set of lenses. If I'm reading the Constitution, the American Constitution, I have to read it like a 1700s British colonial, right? I can't come in reading it like a Brazilian from the 8th century, right? I have to read it like a 1700s colonial, right? From Britain, or at least where my parents were, depending on where you're at on that timeline. But you get the idea, right? You have to read everything with a certain sense of cultural lenses, or else you miss the point. So again, if you read it, judging by today's standards, it sounds horrible, but back then it was revolutionary, right? Back then it was revolutionary. It was huge. And there's always the underlying moral of life matters. Rights matter. People have value. In fact, like there's this other part that people get really mixed up on when it says, like, have you guys ever heard of that one where if a man like rapes a woman in the city and she cries out, then she'll be spared basically, but if she doesn't cry out, then that they will stone her. But if the rape happens in the wilderness, then she shall be spared, essentially. You guys probably have read that before. And people get really like twisted up on that. What they're basically saying is that if you're in a crowded area, you're not seeking help, then you probably committed adultery. Okay, you probably can't cry that you were raped. But if you were fighting and you were seeking help, we probably can do that. Now, it's not saying that that's every single time. It's more the moral of it. Like, hey, we don't always know for sure, but we do know that generally speaking, you should be trying to fight your attacker. And if it happened in the wilderness, you'll always be given the benefit of the doubt. These are things that people just, again, even Christians, we go, oh, I didn't know that. Like, yeah, we're supposed to be the ones who read it. Now, that's one of the problems that a lot of atheists have read these passages, and they have them memorized, and they're going to sling them at you when the time comes. And if you're not ready for those, you will be blindsided. So, good to know. All right. So, and again, case law, the majority of the Torah is a case law. All right. Sorry, I hung out on there way longer than I wanted to. All right. So, then we also see that there is an opportunity for repentance, right? So before I talk about the merciless war. So Paul Copan says this in his book, God's patience, according to the biblical text, Yahweh was willing to wait about 430 years because the sin of the Amorites, which are the Canaanite people, has not yet reached its limit. It says that in Genesis 15:16. In other words, in Abraham's day, the time wasn't ripe for judgment on the Canaanites. The moment wasn't right for them to be driven out and for the land to vomit them out. Sodom and Gomorrah, on the other hand, were ready. Not even 10 righteous people could be found there. Even earlier at the time of Noah, humans had similarly hit a rock bottom. So despite 120 years of Noah's preaching, no one outside his family listened. His contemporaries were also ripe for judgment. So here's one of the things that we don't consider here. If God has purposely waiting, is trying to be patient, and it keeps going into moral decline, then does not God not just have the right, but the obligation to bring some form of judgment? Because here's the thing. In the problem of evil, when this comes up, you hear people do this all the time. Why all these horrible things happen in the world, why does God not stop it? Why doesn't God do something to destroy these people, right? Well, now we have cases where God is actively doing that, and then we go, wow, God, that seems a little harsh. Why did you do that? You can't have it both ways, right? It's either God is just when he executes judgment, or he's not. Either you want him to engage, or you don't want him to engage, okay? And that's why even with Noah and all 8 survivors said that every thought of the entire world was basically wicked, right? It was such moral decline, no one was listening. God basically had to hit a reset button, and there's a reason why in Genesis 6, but we will talk about that probably at another time. Many laws were not binding either, but represented, as I said, case law, and even dealt with situations that were not necessarily ideal. We have laws that do that, right? deal with things that are not ideal. Like, this is not an ideal situation, but now we have to deal with it now that it's a situation, right? Once in a while I'll hear of in fact, I just put the book back today, I read it, we have it here at the church, called Moral Choices, and the guy he'll tell you this crazy tale, and it's like, what's the right moral choice in this? And sometimes you're like, whoa, that's a conundrum, and that's kind of the point. So anyway, thank you.
You're welcome.
I might have to show that here in a second. All right. So now let's talk about the merciless war. Again, the archaeological evidence, and this is something that people don't tell you. The archaeological evidence indicates that no civilian populations existed at Jericho, Ai, and other cities mentioned in Joshua. Other biblical evidence of various cities used as fortresses, citadels, or military outposts also exist. So not only was God patient with the enemies of Israel, but many of these cities were likely military outposts composed primarily of soldiers. And remember, when they went to Jericho, there was this woman named Rahab, who was a harlot, right, a prostitute. And what happened with her? They spared her, right? And she's actually in the lineage of Jesus. Which means, here's the thing, all right? Jesus, the son of David, son of Joseph, our Messiah. We think in our heads that, you'll hear, Israel back then was racist. It was ethnic cleansing. But if that's the case, then how did a woman who was from Jericho end up in the line of Jesus and considered Jewish?
As well as Ruth, who was a Moabite.
Right. And it's because they are actually told to welcome people in, and once you were in and you were partook of the covenant and all that, you were an Israelite. You were considered one of us, right? Like, that was the idea. And so again, there's this weird concept that there was all race-based. It's not. It was values-based. If you read the text, you see more and more where the wickedness was. In fact, I was reading Joshua earlier, and it was funny because go ahead. Anyway, the city so Israelites came upon the city made covenant and made peace with them, even though they lied. They lied about their what?
The Gibeonites.
Gibeonites. I was like, what was it? Yeah, the Gibeonites. They lied, and what happened? Hey, even though you lied,
They made a covenant with them.
Deal's the deal.
yep,
They're
you get
now
the deal's the deal.
passed.
Be honest with us next time. But then what happened? What did the other cities do? The king of Jerusalem at the time. Instead of being like, all right, guys, we're going to unite and we're going to wipe out Israel because they're on the warpath. No, they go, let's go after the Gibeonites because they made a covenant with Israel. So instead of even going after what they would consider the enemy, they go after the people who considered, they left one of us and they joined Israel. So instead of, that should show you the amount of cruelty there, right? Because if we saw like a city do that, we'd probably be like, we got to fight back the enemy. And instead, the Gibeonites, they run up to Joshua like, they're coming to attack us, protect us. And what did God do? He protected them. He's like, all right, my people will stand in defense of you because you surrendered to righteousness in the end of it all. And that's mercy, is it not? Right? Like, God made a decision. I'm going to wipe this out because these people are basically Nazis in the ancient world. And when people surrendered and showed repentance of the covenant, he made a covenant with them and protected them with his own people. So we read this sometimes in a wrong way. Can you already see where the mix-ups are happening, where we kind of insert things that don't exist? And that's why I think it's really important that you understand how some of those laws worked. A lot of these laws were intended, the ones that seem harsh on women, for example, are almost always intended to protect women. But you don't read it that way because we're, post-feminism, post all these different things. But it's like, no, usually it's to try to prevent women from being taken advantage of. And which is actually funny because sometimes it cracks me up. Sometimes the Torah is like, in case this crazy scenario ever happened, for example, all right, her husband died, so she gets divorced, right? And she marries a man. Well, her new husband dies. Okay, she marries another man. He dies. She marries another man, and he dies. So apparently wherever she goes, everyone dies. But anyway, she goes through all this stuff. Well, then it says that she is not allowed to remarry her first husband, even if he is still alive, because the ground has already been tainted. And the whole point was, if a woman's that down on her luck, an abusive and vindictive man could easily take advantage of a woman in that situation, in that world. Which people go, well, why? So what, she's the problem here? No. It's saying like that guy who divorced her because he found fault within her to begin with could easily come around and take advantage of her a second time around, right? And so that's something to be protection, right? There was another one I was going to mention that I think is helpful. Crud, but I can't remember it. Anyway, I hope you guys get the idea. Sometimes we read it the wrong way. If I remember it, I'll discuss it. But some of those are just, it was, man, I don't remember. It's like at the tip of my tongue, but I can't remember it. But anyway, and then of course the other thing you can always do, and this isn't always the best way. Well, you guys are probably already familiar at this point with my two-story problem. But with God, only if God exists can morality really exist. To say something that's barbaric becomes subjective, right? Right? Because if God doesn't exist, we're a space accident. Does space accidents have meaning? No. Do they have morality? Not really. We can agree on rules, but if another group of people disagree with rules, we can't say they're absolutely wrong. We just disagree, right? Because accidents might disagree on things. The Nazis, we just disagreed with. We just thought Jews shouldn't be killed. Because if there's no God, there's no objective moral standard. So here's the thing. If there's no God, all that exists, you guys already know this, is the physical world. And that is only, and the physical world only consists of that which is of physical materials, mountains, trees, your body, right? Organs, things like that. Only the material. However, if God exists, then we have to acknowledge the reality of the metaphysical, which does not exist materialistically. This deals with the questions of meaning, morality, consciousness, love, the nature of those things. Because if God is not real, how do you even define that which is good? You might say, well, that which benefits society. Okay, well, what if society is more benefited by killing the Jews? The Nazis might think that. Now, I know it's such a cliche to always bring up Nazis, or what if Japan really was better off just murdering and raping through China like they did in the 1940s? Well, what if that benefited their society? Well, did it benefit theirs? Well, who cares? It's according to the only physical world, in a Darwinist worldview, it's always about the survival of the fittest, reaching the top of your particular social ladder and taking advantage of that. If it really is survival of the fittest, as a dog-eat-dog world, you can't really complain. Which is why you can always go back to the moral argument that if morals exist, absolute moral values exist, then God has to exist. And if God exists, then you have absolute moral values that you have to hold to. If God does not exist, really all we're doing is disagreeing on moral opinions, not moral facts, right? So if you believe, so in your heart, if you go, I know for a fact that child murder is wrong, then you have to admit that God exists. Otherwise, you're just being inconsistent, right? So otherwise, because no one says, actually, all right, we have a hedgehog. My wife and I have a hedgehog. His name's Alfred. He's our butler. Anyway, Alfred, come to find out, hedgehogs, we were not allowed, when I went to go get the hedgehog, to see any of the mothers, because if anyone disturbs a mother, she gets anxious at all, she will eat her children. Yeah, the love of a mother. But you know what? We don't look at that hedgehog and go, wow, what an immoral monster. You know, you're a murderer. We don't say that. Why? Because animals don't have absolute moral values. But if we did that, we would be like, that person is a monster, kill them with fire, right? Like that would be our mindset. Why? Because if God exists, then absolute moral values exist for those who are created within his own image and know better and have the knowledge of good and evil, right? We know better. The law's written on your heart. So these are things where it's like, those are good things for us to know. So anyway, with that being said, some of the things in this series that we've talked about are difficult and need to be wrestled with. And I can only give you a cursory view in this class, okay? Careful not to get too caught away with everything, because that's also what happens when these subjects come up. People are like, I want to study this, but they're almost overwhelmed. They don't even know where to start, right? So it's okay to be careful. Just take it slowly and study each thing out slowly. Some of the things can be difficult to understand, especially if you think, if the thinking and terminology is new to you. Many of you guys know Jordan Ferry, who normally sits over here, my friend Jordan. His son Connor showed up when he taught two views of God a while ago. And his son is his son, and Jordan talks about this a lot. Connor was like, Dad, finally after today, I think I get what you've been saying. After living with him. It takes sometimes time for us to get used to the terminology and get our brains thinking in the right way. So my whole point of this study and this class has been to foster further study in you for these things, okay? So many lay Christians' responses to the problem of evil and things like this are not good, and they can almost be offensive, which is why I want you guys to just have better responses. So, however, if one commits to a lifetime of study, I think they will find their faith more anchored, they'll find themselves more dedicated, and they will be rewarded for doing so. And I know many who have. So, any questions or comments? Again, I'm either a really good teacher or a really bad one.
Did the Jews have any feeling that, you said that Jews have this great, kill them for this and kill them for that.
Mhm.
Do they emphasize that the Lord will take care of them, and that's why we're sending them off to them?
Actually, yeah, they say that God essentially will be the judger of the soul at some point. Like, so it's like, well, we'll send them here. We're going to stop them from sinning in this world, corrupting their soul and offending God, and send them to God, who will show them either the right mercy or judgment.
And that's what I...
It's like that old school thing in like old wars, like, well, we're going to take them out and let God sort them out, right? I mean, that sounds harsh, but when you're in a very harsh environment, there's almost like a survival mechanism that has to kick in at that point, right? And God has that. Like, there's a reason why there's even laws in the Old Testament, like if a thief breaks into your home, you have the castle law, if you will, to kill him. And people, and nowadays even that's even questioned. Where most of us, and I think for most conservative Christians, we go, what? But he's in my house. I don't know what he's going to do in my house. I just got to stop him. Anyway, Ben.
Show me.
Show them. You know you're dealing with young people. But all right. Let's see here. Was it in my photos? Oh yeah.
If you accepted it, yeah.
Everyone, if God is good, then why doesn't He just stop all the evil in the world? God floods the earth. Everyone.
People don't want God to fix things because it's not going to go well. For us.
Right. It's not pretty. Right. It's not pretty. And
The iPhone watermark.
yeah, the iPhone. Yes. That's my company when I'm in my office and I'm bored. So is iFunny. So whatever, judge me. It's great.
It is great.
All right. So I still can't remember what that law was. I'm still trying to remember. There's one law that's pretty interesting, but I can't remember how it goes. But off the top of my head, it's another one of those many like situations with women. But hi, honey. Oh, these are not just childproof, but parents. Oh, yep, don't forget the cap. Good job. So, anyway. So now, next week, my wife and I will be gone. For her, all she asked for Christmas was a weekend getaway. That's easy. So, then I'll be gone,
I
but...
already took a snow day off. What?
Yeah. Well, that was supposed to be for the voting. So, but then... so Jordan Ferrier will be here next week to teach a class. Then the week after, I'm probably going to have him teach the 2 views of God again, because we did not get that recorded, and I think it's worth having on recording. Plus, I think there's some people in this class who are not there for that I think would be beneficial. And if you were there, you probably need to listen to it again to kind of really get the idea, okay? And then after that, we're going to start a series on the doctrine of man, and that one's going to be a lot more biblical. Like, I'm not saying that this isn't biblical, but this is obviously more philosophical, right? We're dealing with philosophical questions, which means we're just going to be walking through the text. We're going to look at the different views people have had on that, and it's going to be a lot more reading the Bible, commenting on it, so it's not going to be as, like, flashy, okay? I'm not going to have all those things up. But then after that, we'll probably either do a series on hell or maybe look at a closer look at the Old Testament laws, which could be interesting.
That would be interesting.
Yeah, it's super fun. Now I'm actually like more I've studied it more. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's actually a pretty sweet, like really smart system to come up with on some of those things. It's just things we don't think about nowadays because ancient problems, right? So, that was one. That was what it was. I just remember I said ancient problems and see this. All right, real quick, and then I'll let you guys go. Are you guys familiar with also that weird law that if like my brother died, I would have to marry his wife?
Yeah.
That's what I thought you were talking about.
Yeah.
You went through 6 husbands. All right, go
Yeah. So now you can't. First off, you can't tell me that doesn't make every person in this room go, whoa.
Ew.
So And then it's also funny because did you ever notice that the man is judged if he does not try to give her children?
This is 38:9.
Yeah, you have that memorized? I have concerns and questions. More questions than concerns.
His favorite verse.
There's so many. All right. But anyway, so that whole point. So women back then were basically, there's only a few things, right? They would either help manage something like a vineyard, things like that, or their number one job was to bear children. That was and it wasn't like they were like, oh, this is my burden, like nowadays where we look at children as like, where in fact children were considered great blessings of God, and it was a woman's, basically her sole purpose was to raise her children, which is why it's like if she was barren, it was both considered sad for her, but also, and that's why we see that with Sarah, right? So what you're seeing is that when he is saying that is like, hey, if she had, especially if she doesn't have children, you are to marry her, but the reason why is to give her children so she has purpose and she can engage within her role of that society. And not only engage in that role in that society, but also now she's under your protection again, because where would she go if not with you? And then also if she doesn't have children, what is she going to do with her life? And the thing is we go, well, you're forcing that on women. We pretend like the women back then, that's not what they desired earnestly, right? Women desired children back then. They didn't look at it as a burden. They looked at it as a great blessing. So for a woman to lose her husband and she has no other husband to marry, then her brother was to take care of her, okay? If there's no other man who was interested, essentially. Because she could remarry. What?
His brother.
Yeah, it would have to be his brother, which is super weird still, but.
You can look this up. And maybe this is for the woman's desire to be her husband. Women had such a drive to have children. Okay, I mean, that was their purpose in life. 70%, up until the beginning of the 20th century, 70% of women mortality was childbirth.
Up until when?
The beginning of the 20th century.
There was a lot of risk in that, but women, that was something that
70% of female mortality. Now, I'd double check that number, but I read that somewhere.
Huh.
So
I'll be curious on how that study went.
having children back then.
But it's still one of those things where, in general, we look at that as barbaric, but to them this was a woman being able to take care of, and this was something that a way for her to partake still within the covenant of her society. And again, so that seems so bizarre and weird, and if the man didn't, he was punished. I find that interesting. Like but it's not saying she couldn't ever remarry someone else besides her brother, because there's other laws there, right? If her husband dies, she is free to marry somebody, so she can still marry. But if she has no one to take care of her, her brother was too. And I know, again, it sounds weird to us, but back then it was a totally different world.
Now, did he have a wife himself, or is that only if he was?
Sometimes he did have a wife, yes.
But it all had to do with preservation of the clan and the property and all that stuff played into it.
So it's very strange with that. But yes, he sometimes would have a wife. But that's back then. Polygamy wasn't that in the biblical times. I mean, how many wives did David and Solomon have? You know.
So that's another good talk because I don't understand that at all.
And a lot of Brandon before I.
So that's what kinsmen redeemers were for. Like
Right.
if I had, if I died, I don't have a brother, but Megan and I get married, I die, and she marries my brother. Whoever the child they have would be my heir.
Yep.
Not his.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Oh yeah, I forgot because it's bearing. It says if you do not bear your brother, do not give her your brother's child, essentially.
Right.
So you are doing on his behalf, so to speak.
As a woman, I'm still not okay with that.
Yeah,
but
it's so weird. It's because we're so. I mean, it's such a different world. Like it just is. Paul.
So I had a question
Yeah.
that goes away from that topic, but still with Old Testament, because one of the arguments I've heard about, you talk about bondservant and how it's a different idea than what we think of today.
Mhm.
And the argument actually I've heard has been, okay, well that was the ideal, and then the whole concept of Jubilee, that at the end of those 7 years, they're all released, land's given, all that, and I've heard the argument that, well, there's no evidence of Jubilee ever actually taking place, and that was just a good idea, but it never actually happened.
I mean, that would be that. I would argue that's an argument from silence, because it's like, oh, so you say there's no evidence of it, but in the Mishnah we have it recorded, in the Torah we have it recorded. Oh, you're saying there's no external evidence from the society which internally is saying they do this. So yeah, I wouldn't expect to find external evidence of that, only internal evidence of how that society operates from records of that internal society. So yeah, that would still be like, well, we have that written in the Torah, that was how they did it. We have that written in the Mishnah.
Especially because it was so different from every other nation.
Yeah.
Like, you wouldn't see, like, if Egypt just decided to do that, like, hey, I'm going to release my slaves, you would have that recorded. Actually, you do have it recorded.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Because it was outside the norm, but in Jewish culture, it was very different.
Right. So, and that's why a lot of these things, it's like, for us it does seem strange and foreign, but to them this was like, hey, this is how you survive. Hey, this is how we take care of our own.
Yeah.
Hey, this is how we can still operate within that. Like back to what we were saying with like women marrying, like the brother. Well, if there's no other candidate, you need to give her children, so that way her brother's line can live on and she can live on. She's not going to be taken advantage, sold into sex slavery, live a homeless, destitute life where she feels like she's not contributing to society at all because her role as a mother has now been robbed from her because she lost her husband and she has no other candidates. And again, for us, that's weird because, I mean, if we're kind of, you're in realty, right? For us, we go, well, women can have careers, we can do these things, but back then they didn't have those options. And so it's just, again, it's strange, but when you look at it, you go, oh, I can definitely see why that was a thing. And in our world, we find that strange. Also, another weird one. I'm sorry, I gotta shut up. And there's the other one, which is like if a woman is captured in war, like a prisoner of war, right? Okay, we took this camp, and now you see a woman, you find her beautiful. Now, keep in mind, a lot of women lived horribly in other societies. I mean, we're talking worse than things that you already get it. Yeah, I mean, they were basically glorified childbearers and sex slaves. That's basically what they were in a lot of societies. So a lot of times, there's even been record of women wanting to be part of Israel because they would be treated better. But even if she was won over through war, then she was actually not allowed to marry, or no man could even be with her at all for a month. She was to grieve her family and be left alone and loved and respected, and then things could move on from there if a man wanted to marry her. And so she was even given time to grieve, which is huge compared to what they would back then. It was normally just, we break into your city, we rape and pillage, and we murder you. And so back then it's like, nope, show people mercy and integrate them into your society, but give them time. You can't just demand things from them. So anyway, does some of that make more sense? Maybe at least you can go, well, maybe I should look into that a little bit more before I think all of it's horrible. At least maybe.
Everything was horrible back then.
Yeah, it's like you tell me one area that's like that was ideal. This wasn't. It was the ancient Near East. I mean, it's crazy. So anyway, but we can do a series on that eventually. That's going to take me time to prepare though, because that's a lot of sources to discuss.